The gavel came down so hard it cracked the edge of Reverend Aldous Peel's oak pulpit, and Rosa Fletcher felt the sound like a fist to the sternum. "Thief!" someone shouted from the back of the church, and the word rolled forward through the crowd like a stone thrown into still water, gathering force as it moved. "Murderer!" said another voice, higher, sharper. And then the crowd was no longer individual voices but one single roaring thing. And Rosa stood alone at the front of it all with her hands clasped in front of her, and her dark eyes wide open, refusing to cry, refusing to collapse, even as the world she had spent 3 years building in Caldwell Creek, Kansas, came apart at every seam. Reverend Peel raised one thick hand and called for quiet, but the quiet did not come. Mayor Elias Dunmore sat in the first pew with his arms crossed and a smile hidden just barely beneath the surface of his solemn expression, and Rosa saw that smile, and she understood in that moment that this was not a trial. It was an execution. The verdict had been decided before she ever walked through the door. "Rosa Fletcher," Mayor Dunmore said, rising slowly, savoring every syllable of her name as though he had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. "The people of Caldwell Creek have heard testimony this morning from 3 credible witnesses. They have heard that you were present at the Holloway Ranch on the night of October the 2nd. They have heard that you were seen removing valuables from the main house. And they have heard, God help us, that your hands were stained red when you fled into the dark." He paused, letting the silence do its work. "Thomas Holloway is dead, Miss Fletcher. His ranch has been robbed, and every soul in this room wants to know what you have to say for yourself." Rosa opened her mouth. And then the doors at the back of the church flew open. Every head turned. Marshal Hugh Crawford stood in the doorway with the late October sun blazing behind him, a leather satchel in one hand and a folded document in the other, his badge catching the light like a signal fire. He was 6 feet and a fraction tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair pushed back from a face that was lean and deliberate, the kind of face that did not waste expressions. His gray eyes moved across the room with the calm precision of a man who had walked into worse situations than this, and had walked out of them again. "I apologize for the interruption," Hugh Crawford said, and his voice was not loud, but it cut through the noise the way a blade cuts through rope, clean and complete. "But before this proceeding goes any further, I have proof, evidence that contradicts every word those 3 witnesses said this morning." He held up the leather satchel, "and I would like very much for this room to hear it." The silence that followed was absolute. Rosa Fletcher stared at Hugh Crawford across the length of that crowded church, and something shifted behind her eyes. She had never in her life expected anyone to come through that door for her. She had been alone for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like when someone stood beside you. And this man, this marshal with his steady eyes and his unshakable voice, was standing beside her now, in front of God and the whole hostile town of Caldwell Creek, and she did not yet know why, but she knew it mattered. She knew it mattered more than she could say. 3 weeks earlier, Rosa Fletcher had arrived in Caldwell Creek with $32, a carpet bag, and a letter of employment from the Holloway household. This was the autumn of 1879, and Caldwell Creek was a cattle town sitting at the edge of the Kishom Trail in southern Kansas, the kind of place that had sprung up fast and hard in the years after the war, full of men with ambitions and tempers, and not quite enough law to keep either one properly contained. The town had a main street with a saloon, a dry goods store, a land office, a doctor's surgery, a livery, and a church, and at the far end of it, a marshal's office with a small jail attached to the back. Rosa had come from Wichita, where she had spent 2 years working as a seamstress and saving enough money to eventually move somewhere she could start fresh. The letter from Eleanor Holloway, Thomas Holloway's wife, had offered her a position as household manager on the Holloway Ranch, which sat about 4 miles outside of town. The pay was fair, the letter was courteous, and Rosa had no reason to suspect that taking the position would change the entire direction of her life. She had not expected Eleanor Holloway to be dead by the time she arrived. The woman had passed from a fever 6 days before Rosa's stagecoach pulled into Caldwell Creek, and Thomas Holloway was not the warm, measured man his wife had described in her correspondence. He was hard-edged and suspicious, a rancher in his late 50s who had built his fortune with his hands and trusted it to no one. When Rosa arrived at the ranch with her letter and her carpetbag, Holloway had looked her over with the particular coldness of a man who had decided something before it had been given a proper chance. "I'll keep you on," he had said, "because Eleanor hired you and I honor my wife's arrangements. But I want you to understand something, Miss Fletcher. This house is mine. Everything in it is mine, and I will know if anything is disturbed." Rosa had said yes, sir, and she had gone to work. The weeks that followed were not easy, but Rosa Fletcher had never expected easy. She was 26 years old, and she had been managing her own life since she was 17, when her father passed and left her with nothing but his debts and a small talent for keeping order in chaos. She was not a woman who complained. She organized Holloway's household with quiet competence, kept his accounts straight, managed the staff of 2 hired hands and a cook named Bessie, and did her best to remain invisible enough that Holloway's suspicion had nothing to attach itself to. But there were other people in Caldwell Creek who had already decided what Rosa Fletcher was. Mayor Elias Dunmore was one of them. Dunmore was a man of 52 who had come to Caldwell Creek in 1873 with seed money from a railroad speculation, and had since made himself the most powerful man in 3 counties through a combination of political maneuvering, selective generosity, and a complete lack of moral restraint when it came to protecting his interests. He owned the land office, held the deed to the saloon, and had investments in half the cattle operations along the trail. He was also, as Rosa would eventually learn, in a long-standing dispute with Thomas Holloway over a strip of grazing land that sat between their properties, a dispute that had been building since 1876 and had recently turned ugly. Rosa had not known any of this when she arrived. She had simply gone to work, kept her head down, and tried to rebuild her life one careful day at a time. The first time she met Hugh Crawford was at Bessie's kitchen table. It was a Tuesday afternoon in mid-September, and Rosa had ridden into town on the Holloway buckboard to pick up supplies from the dry goods store. She had stopped at the marshal's office on her return to ask whether there had been any trouble reported on the road south, because one of the hired hands had mentioned seeing unfamiliar riders near the south pasture fence line. She had not expected the marshal to be worth looking at. Hugh Crawford was 31 years old and had been the marshal of Caldwell Creek for 2 years, appointed by the county sheriff after the previous marshal had retired on account of a leg wound that never properly healed. He had grown up in Missouri, had served briefly in the Army out of Fort Leavenworth, and had come to law work through a combination of circumstance and a deep-seated conviction that order mattered, that it was worth protecting, and that the people most likely to be destroyed by its absence were the people who had the fewest resources to protect themselves. He was not a particularly talkative man in general, but when Rosa Fletcher walked into his office and asked about riders near the south pasture in a voice that was careful and precise and entirely unadorned, he found himself paying more attention than the question strictly required. "I'll ride out that way this week and take a look," he had said, and then he had offered her a cup of coffee because Bessie had sent one of her pies to the marshal's office that morning by way of thanks for some earlier errand, and the pie was sitting on his desk, and it seemed rude not to offer a piece to anyone who stopped by. They had sat at his small table by the window and talked for 40 minutes about nothing that should have been interesting and was inexplicably, thoroughly interesting. And when Rosa left, she had the strange, unsettled feeling of a woman who has been reminded that she is a person, not just a function. Hugh Crawford spent the rest of that afternoon being significantly less productive than usual. He rode out to check on the south pasture fence line 2 days later. He did not find any sign of trouble. He did find Rosa Fletcher in the paddock outside the barn, talking quietly to one of Holloway's horses with the particular ease of a woman who was more comfortable with animals than people. And he spent 10 minutes longer than he had intended discussing the horse's temperament before he rode back to town. Over the following weeks, their paths crossed with what might have been called coincidence if either of them had been inclined to examine it too carefully. He stopped at the dry goods store on Thursday mornings, which was when Rosa came in for the Holloway household order. She dropped off a package at the land office every 2 weeks, which meant she passed the marshal's office both ways. He began to linger at the window around those times. She began to take the long way back to the buckboard. Nothing was said directly. Nothing was admitted. But there was a conversation happening between them that did not require words, and it was the most honest conversation Rosa Fletcher had had in years. The dark past she carried was not a dramatic one, but it was heavy. There had been a man in Wichita, a merchant named Garrett Soules, who had courted her with patience and apparent sincerity, and then, when she had trusted him enough to be vulnerable, had used that vulnerability to extract a loan he had no intention of repaying, and had subsequently spread rumors about her character when she asked for the money back. She had survived the social damage through sheer stubbornness and the support of a few good women who knew better, but it had changed something in her. It had made her careful about where she placed her trust, and had made her wary of the particular trap of believing that a man's kind attention meant what it appeared to mean. Hugh Crawford did not feel like that kind of trap. He felt like the opposite of it, and that was its own kind of dangerous. On the 1st of October, Thomas Holloway called Rosa into his study and told her that he was renegotiating the terms of her employment. He would pay her less, effective immediately, because in his estimation she was not performing the full range of duties he required. Rosa, who had been performing every duty asked of her and several that had not been, understood at once that this had nothing to do with her performance. Holloway was a man who had decided she could be pushed. She told him politely and without hesitation that she would not accept reduced wages for the same work, and that if he wished to change her duties, she was happy to discuss a revised arrangement in writing. Holloway's face had gone the color of old brick. "You have a sharp tongue for someone in your position," he had said. "I have a fair mind," Rosa had replied. "I expect the same in return." She had left his study without raising her voice and had gone back to the kitchen accounts, and her hands had trembled only a little, and Bessie, who had been listening from the hall, had given her a look of silent, fierce approval. 2 days later, Thomas Holloway was found dead in his study. The story came to town fast, the way stories always did in a place where everyone's lives were pressed together close enough to create friction. The ranch hand Doyle Marsh had discovered Holloway's body on the morning of October 3rd, slumped in his chair behind the big oak desk, with what appeared to be a head wound. The strongbox in the corner of the study was open and empty. $340 in coin and notes was missing, along with a silver pocket watch and a small amount of gold jewelry that had belonged to Holloway's late wife. The sheriff had been summoned from the county seat, but it would take him the better part of 2 days to arrive, and in the meantime, the investigation fell to Hugh Crawford. He arrived at the ranch within an hour of the news reaching town and spent the morning methodically examining the study, the grounds around the main house, and the outbuildings. He questioned Bessie, who had been in town at the market on the morning in question. He questioned the 2 hired hands, Doyle Marsh and a quieter man named Franklin Reese. He noted the wound, the position of the body, the state of the strongbox, and a number of other details that he kept carefully in his own mind, while he arranged for the body to be transported to town. He also noted that Rosa Fletcher was the only person on the property who had not been present when the body was found, which was because she had been at the dry goods store in town collecting the weekly supply order, a fact he intended to verify, and did, within the hour, with 3 separate witnesses including the store owner himself. What he did not yet understand was the shape of the trap that was being built around her. He came to understand it on the morning of October the 5th, when Dunmore arrived at his office with the three witnesses. Their names were Silas Pratt, Vernon Cole, and Agnes Whitmore. Silas Pratt was a drifter who had been in town for 3 weeks and who, Hugh noted, had been spending money freely in the saloon without any apparent source of income. Vernon Cole was a former ranch hand who had been let go from the Holloway property 8 months prior, and who harbored what appeared to be a significant grievance about it. Agnes Whitmore was a respectable widow who ran the town's boarding house and who, Hugh also noted, had recently been granted an extension on a significant debt she owed the bank, a bank in which Dunmore held a controlling interest. Each of them told a version of the same story. They had been on the road near the Holloway Ranch on the night of October 2nd. They had seen Rosa Fletcher near the main house. They had seen her carrying something. They had seen, in Pratt's telling, blood on her hands. Dunmore sat beside them with his arms crossed and his expression composed, and said that he felt it was his civic duty as mayor to bring this information forward. Hugh Crawford wrote everything down in his notebook and said he would investigate the matter fully. What he did not say was that he had already found 3 things in his examination of the Holloway property that told him a completely different story. He needed to find the 4th before he could prove any of it. Rosa Fletcher did not know, when Mayor Dunmore came to the boarding house where she had been staying since Holloway's death left her without a position, that she was already surrounded. She did not know that the trap had been sprung. She found out the way the people of Caldwell Creek found most things out, which was that someone told someone who told someone else, and by the time the news reached her, it had already become a fact in the town's mind. When she went out that morning to look for alternative work, the door of the milliner's shop was closed to her. The woman who owned the dressmakers had been a brief acquaintance and now found somewhere else to be when she saw Rosa coming. At the dry goods store, the conversation stopped when she walked in and did not start again until she left. She understood then what was happening. She went directly to Hugh Crawford's office. He was there bent over his desk with documents spread across every surface, and he looked up when she came in with an expression that was careful and searching and something else beneath it, something that she could not quite name but that made her breath catch. "You already know," she said. "I've been working since before dawn," he said. "Sit down, Miss Fletcher." She sat. "Tell me what they're saying," he told her. He did not soften it. He laid out the witnesses, the testimony, the specifics of what each person claimed, and he watched her face the whole time with those gray eyes that missed nothing and assumed nothing. And when he was finished, he said, "I need you to tell me exactly where you were on the night of October the 2nd. Every hour, if you can. Every person you spoke to." Rosa told him. She had been at the boarding house all evening. The boarding house keeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Hollies, had served her supper at the common table with 3 other boarders. She had gone to her room at 8:30. She had a book she was partway through, a novel she had bought from the traveling merchant who came through Wichita. "Can anyone confirm you didn't leave?" Hugh asked. "Mrs. Hollies's dog sleeps in the hall and barks at any movement after 9 o'clock, Rosa said. "Ask her." Hugh wrote it down. "I'm going to find the evidence I need," he said. "But I need you to trust me with something." She looked at him across the desk, and there was a whole conversation in that look, compressed and silent and heavy with everything they had not said over the past weeks. "What do you need?" she said. "Tell me everything you know about Mayor Dunmore's dispute with Holloway over the South pasture land." Rosa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How did you know I knew about it?" "Because you're a household manager, and household managers know everything," Hugh said. "And because I watched you look at Dunmore in church last Sunday with the particular expression of a woman who does not trust the man in front of her but has chosen not to say so yet." Something happened in Rosa's chest at that, something warm and startling. She told him everything she knew. The dispute over the South pasture had been going on for 3 years. The land sat between the Holloway property and the western edge of town, and it was valuable not only for grazing, but because the new rail spur that the Kansas Pacific was surveying would likely pass directly through it. Holloway had refused to sell at Dunmore's offered price, which was significantly below market value. Dunmore had threatened legal action over an old boundary survey. Holloway had countered with his own legal challenge. The matter had been stuck in a state of expensive, bitter stalemate. With Holloway dead and no heirs, the estate would eventually go to settlement, and the land would come up for sale. Dunmore, if he acted quickly enough, could acquire it at a price he controlled, unless Holloway had made other arrangements. Rosa mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that in the week before his death, Holloway had received a visit from a lawyer named Sutherland from Dodge City. She did not know the nature of that visit, but she had overheard Holloway saying to Sutherland that he wanted everything in order. Hugh Crawford was very still for a moment. Then he rose from his chair and put on his hat. "Stay inside today," he said. "Don't go to the town meeting if Dunmore calls one, and lock your door." "Hugh," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name, and they both noticed it. "I know," he said. It was not an answer to anything specific, but it was an answer to the thing underneath. He left, and she sat in the chair in his office for a long moment after the door closed, with her hands folded in her lap and her heart doing something complicated and unwilling to be managed. What Hugh Crawford did in the next 18 hours was a kind of focused, methodical desperation. He rode to Dodge City. It was a full day's ride each way, but he went because Sutherland's office was there, and because a dead man's last legal arrangements were potentially the only thing that could explain the full shape of what Dunmore had done. He rode through the night, arrived at dawn, spent an hour in Sutherland's office, and rode back with the document folded in the satchel and a clarity about the situation that was both vindicating and infuriating. Thomas Holloway, 2 days before his death, had filed a new will. In that will, he left the disputed South pasture land not to any individual, but to a land trust that would prevent any single party from acquiring it for 10 years. He had also, in an additional document, sworn a statement about Dunmore's attempts to coerce him into selling, including a specific reference to a veiled threat Dunmore had made in August about ensuring that Holloway's household arrangements became a source of difficulty if he refused to cooperate. The reference to Rosa was oblique but unmistakable. Holloway had written that the mayor had suggested he could see to it that his new household employee did not last long in Caldwell Creek if Holloway needed a reason to reconsider. It was not quite a confession. It was not quite a murder order, but it was a map, and Hugh had the other pieces. The first was a boot print he had found outside the study window at the Holloway ranch, a print from a distinctive heel pattern that did not match Holloway, Rosa, Bessie, or either of the hired hands. He had made a plaster cast of it and had it wrapped in cloth in his saddlebag. The second was a pawn ticket. He had found it on the floor near the strongbox, partially concealed under the edge of the desk. It was dated October 3rd and bore the name of a pawn shop in a town 20 miles east. He had sent a telegram to the town's law office, asking them to hold whoever came to collect on that ticket. The third was a letter he had found behind the loose brick in Holloway's fireplace, where a cautious man sometimes hides things he does not trust to a strongbox. The letter was from Dunmore to Holloway, and it was not gentle. It outlined, in terms that were just barely inside the language of business, what would happen to Holloway's reputation, his land title, and his household if he did not sign the transfer agreement by October the 5th. The letter was dated September 28th. Thomas Holloway had been killed on October 2nd. And now it was October 6th, and the town meeting Dunmore had called was happening in the church at 10 o'clock in the morning, and Rosa Fletcher was standing at the front of it while the crowd called her a thief and a murderer, and Hugh Crawford was walking through the back door with a satchel full of truth. He stood at the back of the church with the sun behind him and let the noise die down and said he had proof, and then he walked forward through the crowd, and the crowd parted not because they wanted to, but because his badge and his bearing left them no other option. He stopped beside Rosa Fletcher. She was close enough that he could see the controlled steadiness in her face and the cost of maintaining it. And something in him that was usually very carefully locked went quietly unlocked. "Marshal Crawford," Dunmore said, his voice carrying the precise temperature of a man who has just found an obstacle in his path and is deciding how to remove it. "This is a town proceeding, and we have 3 witnesses who have given sworn testimony. I have the new will of Thomas Holloway," Hugh said, and held up the folded document. "Drafted by the law office of Sutherland and Associates in Dodge City on October 1st, witnessed and notarized. I also have a letter written by Mayor Dunmore to Thomas Holloway on September 28th that constitutes a direct threat against Mr. Holloway's person and property." He held up the letter. "And I have a cast of a boot print found at the scene of the crime that does not match any person resident at the Holloway Ranch." The room was very quiet. "I also," Hugh continued, his voice steady as a heartbeat, "have confirmation from the law office in Harper County that a man matching the description of Silas Pratt attempted to collect on a pawn ticket yesterday morning for items that correspond precisely to the valuables reported stolen from the Holloway strongbox." Pratt in the second pew went the color of chalk. Dunmore stood. His composure was cracking at the edges, but he was a man who had spent 30 years hiding what he was, and old habits did not die fast. "Those documents could be fabricated," he said. "A desperate man protecting a woman he has an obvious personal interest in." "You can say whatever you like about my personal interests, Mayor," Hugh said. "But I'd ask you to do it in front of the county sheriff, who will be arriving in Caldwell Creek tomorrow morning. I've also sent telegrams to the Kansas Attorney General's office and to the editor of the Dodge City Times." He looked around the room. "The people of this town deserve to know the truth about what happened to Thomas Holloway, and they deserve to know what was done to Rosa Fletcher to cover it up." He turned and looked at her then briefly, and there was something in that look that was not the marshal speaking but the man, and she felt it in every place that she had been carefully protecting for 3 years. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Dunmore did not leave quietly. He had men with him, 2 men who were more muscle than principle, and there was a bad moment near the door when one of them put a hand on Hugh's arm, and Hugh removed it with the kind of quiet efficiency that made the man step back and reconsider his options. Rosa found herself moving without thinking, stepping to Hugh's side, and he glanced at her with something that was halfway between surprise and an expression she could not fully read. The 2 men from Dunmore's side backed down. Dunmore left, and the room watched him go, and the color of the crowd changed the way sky changes before weather, uncertain and then suddenly shifting. Reverend Peel, to his credit, called for order and called for prayer, and then, in a departure from form that surprised everyone including himself, said that it seemed to him that a grave injustice had nearly been committed against a young woman of evident good character, and that the town ought to sit with the weight of how quickly they had been willing to believe the worst. Several people in that room had the grace to look at the floor. Rosa stood at the front of the church with her hands still clasped and her spine still straight, and her eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears and not quite triumph. It was the complicated, aching feeling of a person who has been fought for, who has felt the shock of it, and who does not yet know what to do with the sensation. Hugh stayed at her side as the room emptied, and when it was just the 2 of them and Reverend Peel retreating quietly to his sacristy, he turned to her and said, "Are you all right?" She laughed. It was a short, startled sound, not entirely like laughter, more like something releasing. "No," she said honestly, "but I will be." "Yes," he said, "you will." They walked out of the church together and stood in the October light, and the main street of Caldwell Creek was going about its business around them with the slightly embarrassed energy of a crowd that has witnessed its own worst nature and would prefer not to discuss it. "You rode to Dodge City," Rosa said. "I needed the will. That was a 40-mile ride." "I'm aware of that," Hugh said. She looked at him. "Why?" He was quiet for a long moment, and the wind moved through the street and took a handful of dust with it, and a horse shifted at the hitching post in front of the saloon, and somewhere a woman was calling to a child, and the ordinary world was happening all around them while something else entirely was happening between them. "Because the truth mattered," he said finally, "and because you mattered, and I was not going to let this town make a lie true just because it was convenient." Rosa Fletcher had been careful for 3 years. She had been careful with her money and her words and her heart, and she had been right to be careful, and none of that careful preparation had protected her against the thing she was feeling right now standing in the October sun beside this steady, serious, remarkable man. "Thank you," she said, and the words felt entirely insufficient and also the only possible ones. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Dunmore is still in town. I need to see the sheriff when he arrives tomorrow, and I need to make sure the legal case is airtight. This is not finished." "I know," she said, "but it's different now." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "It is." The sheriff arrived the next morning, as promised. His name was Aldercott, a broad, weathered man from Wichita who had seen enough of the frontier to be thoroughly unshockable, and who, upon examining Hugh's evidence with the careful attention it deserved, spent the better part of 2 hours asking the right questions, and then went directly to collect Silas Pratt. Pratt, faced with the pawn ticket and the boot print cast, and the news that Vernon Cole had already begun talking in exchange for reduced charges, gave up everything he knew inside of 20 minutes. The full shape of it emerged over the following days, and it was as ugly as Rosa had feared, and as complete as Hugh had suspected. Dunmore had arranged Holloway's death. He had hired Pratt as the instrument of it, using Cole as the go-between, and had intended to use the resulting confusion to claim the property through the legal chaos of an unsettled estate. Rosa had been chosen as the scapegoat not merely because she was convenient, but because she was an outsider with no family in the county, no political connections, and a history of having been falsely accused before, which Dunmore had somehow known about and calculated would make her less credible. Agnes Whitmore, the boarding-house widow, had not known the full plan. She had agreed to say what she was told in exchange for the debt extension, believing she was helping to remove a woman who had somehow offended Dunmore's sense of the proper social order. When the sheriff interviewed her, she wept in a way that was partly genuine and partly the reflexive distress of a woman who had just discovered that the full weight of what she had done was about to land on her. Dunmore was arrested on the morning of October 8th and taken to the county seat in irons. The sight of it drew half the town into the main street, and Rosa stood on the porch of the boarding house and watched the wagon go with an expression that was not satisfied but was something close to settled, the particular quality of a weight being lifted that you had been carrying so long you had stopped noticing it. The weeks that followed were a kind of reconstruction. The town's attitude toward Rosa shifted in the complicated way that collective guilt tends to operate, not cleanly or all at once, but in accumulations of small gestures. The milliner reopened her door. The woman from the dressmaker's stopped finding somewhere else to be. Mrs. Hollis, who had in truth always liked Rosa and had felt terrible about the trial by church, made her a special dinner and gave her a better room. Rosa found a new position, not as a household manager but as assistant bookkeeper to the dry goods store, whose owner, a methodical man named Alcott, had been quietly appalled by what had nearly happened and felt that offering her legitimate employment was the least he could do. The work suited her. She had always been better with numbers than with people's expectations. And she and Hugh Crawford began, with great care and no small amount of mutual stubborn reticence, to do the thing they had been edging toward since that first Tuesday afternoon at the small table by the window. They had dinner at the boarding-house dining room on the Tuesday after the arrest. It was a public dinner, at the common table, with Mrs. Hollis and 2 other boarders present, and it was entirely proper, and it was also undeniably, irreversibly a dinner in the sense that mattered. They talked about Sutherland's legal interpretation of Holloway's will. They talked about the weather coming in from the northwest. They talked about the book Rosa was reading, which turned out to be a novel Hugh had also read, which they both found mildly surprising and privately delightful. And by the time the meal was finished, the other diners had drifted away and they were still talking. He walked her to the foot of the stairs when the evening ended. "Same time next week," he said. "I expect so," she said. He smiled. It was a quiet smile, not a large one, but it changed his whole face in a way that Rosa thought about for the rest of the evening and most of the following morning. The courtship that developed between them over the autumn and into the winter of 1879 had the quality of two very careful people discovering that they had found someone worth being less careful around, and discovering it slowly, which somehow made each small step feel more significant than 100 dramatic gestures would have. They rode together on Sunday mornings, initially because the South pasture land was under legal review and someone needed to maintain an eye on the fence line, and then later because they wanted to, and the pretense was let quietly go. He was not a man who talked easily about himself, and she was not a woman who pressed, and what they found between them was a kind of comfortable depth that did not require constant filling. They could ride for half a mile without speaking, and it was not silence but presence. She told him about Wichita, about Garrett Souls and the money and the rumors and the year she had spent rebuilding her reputation stitch by careful stitch. She told him without dramatizing it, the way you tell someone something when you have decided they are trustworthy, which is the most significant kind of decision a person can make. He told her about Missouri, about his father, who had been a stern and not unkind man who had expected a great deal and given little praise, and who had died when Hugh was 22. About the year he had spent in the army before deciding that he was better suited to civil law than military order. About the woman he had thought he would marry when he was 25, a school teacher in Leavenworth who had eventually decided that the life of a marshal's wife was not the one she wanted, and who had been honest and kind about it, but whose departure had confirmed for Hugh a conviction he had been carrying since his father's silence, which was that he was easier to leave than to stay for. Rosa listened to this without interrupting, and when he finished she said, "That woman was not wrong about her own needs, but she was wrong about you." Hugh was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What makes you say that?" "Because you are the kind of man worth staying for," Rosa said. And she didn't see it. That's her limitation, not yours. He looked at her, then the way he had looked at her in the doorway of the church, with that expression that was not quite readable but was entirely felt, and something between them that had been carefully maintained at a certain distance closed another degree. The first time he took her hand, it was February, and they were coming back from a Sunday ride, and it had begun to snow, lightly at first and then with more conviction, and she had been shivering slightly even with her coat buttoned, and he had reached across from his horse to hers and taken her gloved hand in his own with a naturalness that suggested it was something he had been wanting to do for a very long time and had simply been waiting for the right moment. She let him hold it. She did not pull away. She looked at the snow and felt warm from the inside out. "Hugh," she said. "Yes," he said. He was not asking a question. He was answering one. That was February. In March, he asked if he could call on her properly. This was the language of 1879, and of a man who respected the forms even while feeling everything that existed beneath them. And Rosa, who had been expecting the question and who had known her answer since approximately October, said yes with a composure that did not entirely match the state of her heart. The calling on consisted of evenings at the boarding-house sitting-room, which Mrs. Hollis managed with the satisfied air of a woman who had engineered the whole thing, which she had not, but was not above taking credit for. They played cards with Mrs. Hollis and one of the other boarders and talked, and occasionally, when the other two were occupied, talked quietly and entirely privately in the way that people do when they are in the early, extraordinary stages of realizing that another person has become the most interesting and most necessary presence in their world. He brought her things, not expensive things. He brought her a book he had ordered from the catalog in Wichita because she had mentioned liking the author. He brought her a small jar of honey from a farm outside town because she had said once that she thought honey was undervalued as a luxury. He brought her nothing impractical or showy because he was not a showy man, and she loved this about him the way she loved all of his particular qualities, quietly and with the kind of love that does not need to announce itself. She made him things. She repaired his second-best coat, which had a tear in the left sleeve that he had been meaning to attend to for months, and she did it without making a production of it, simply left it on his desk one morning with the sleeve mended perfectly. She made him a meal at the boarding house kitchen when Mrs. Hollis was out and brought it to his office, and they ate at his desk among his papers in what was probably not the most romantic setting possible but which felt, to both of them, like one of the best evenings either of them had ever had. In April, the legal proceedings against Dunmore concluded at the county seat. He was found guilty of conspiring to commit murder, of fraud in connection with the property acquisition scheme, and of suborning false testimony. The sentence was 15 years in the state penitentiary. Vernon Cole received 7 years. Silas Pratt, whose cooperation had been extensive if not entirely voluntary, received 5. Agnes Whitmore was fined and placed on a period of supervised good behavior by the court. The judge, a practical man, noted that she had acted out of fear and financial desperation rather than malice, and while this did not excuse her conduct, it did distinguish it from the deliberate cruelty of the men at the center of the scheme. Rosa, who had been asked for her perspective by the sheriff prior to sentencing, had said that she thought Mrs. Whitmore had been manipulated and that the punishment ought to reflect the nature of that manipulation. The judge agreed. Rosa had not had to do this. It would have been entirely understandable, even expected, for her to want Agnes Whitmore to face the full force of the court's displeasure. The fact that she did not, that she thought even in the middle of her own injury about the difference between malice and desperation, was the kind of thing that the people of Caldwell Creek noticed and absorbed quietly. The town's understanding of Rosa Fletcher continued to shift in the way collective opinions shift when they have been found to be wrong, partially through genuine reconsideration, and partially through the human tendency to claim that one had never quite believed the original story. The Holloway property was still in legal settlement. The land trust Holloway had established in his will held, and the rail spur, when the Kansas Pacific Survey was finalized in the spring of 1880, was routed slightly differently than anticipated, through terrain that suited the engineers better. The south pasture land ended up being used for something rather more mundane, which was grazing by a cooperative of 3 small ranchers who had been trying to establish themselves in the area since 1877. The legal costs were covered by the sale of Holloway's cattle, and Bessie the cook, who was mentioned specifically in a codicil to Holloway's will, received a small payment that allowed her to retire to live with her daughter in Wichita. Rosa was there when Bessie left. They embraced in the street outside the stage office, and Bessie, who was not a sentimental woman by constitution, pressed Rosa's hand firmly and said, "You find yourself something good, girl. You've earned it." Rosa watched the stage pull away and felt Hugh beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through his coat and hers, and she thought that maybe she already had. He asked her to marry him on a Saturday evening in May of 1880. They had been walking along the creek that gave the town its name, which ran along the northern edge of the property that held the town's small cemetery and the meadow beyond it, and the light was doing something extraordinary with the cottonwoods, and Rosa had been talking about a letter she had received from a cousin in Missouri and was not really paying attention to where they were going, and when she looked up, she found that they had stopped walking and Hugh was turned toward her with an expression she had never seen on him before, which was the expression of a man who has come to the edge of something important and has decided to step off it. He said her name, just her name. She went very still. He said that he had been thinking for some time about what he wanted to say, and that none of the things he had thought to say seemed adequate to the actual situation, which was that she was the most extraordinary person he had ever met, not in a way that required a great occasion, but in the daily, enduring way that he found her presence the thing he oriented toward, the thing that made the rest of the world make better sense. He said that he was not a man who found ease in declarations, and she knew that, and he hoped she would take the difficulty of this declaration as some measure of its sincerity. He said that he wanted to spend the rest of his life making sure she knew she was seen and valued and not alone, and that he wanted to do that legally and formally and with every commitment that was available to him. And he asked her, with a directness that was entirely him, if she would marry him. Rosa Fletcher stood in the May light by Caldwell Creek and felt something in her chest become very spacious and very quiet, the way the sky goes quiet after a long storm, with that particular quality of clean, open space that follows a great deal of held tension. "Yes," she said. "Hugh, yes." He exhaled, and she realized he had been holding his breath. This steady, composed, unshakable man had been holding his breath waiting for her answer, and she found this so purely dear that she stepped forward and put her arms around him, which she had not done before, and he held her with a certainty that felt like it had always been there, waiting. They married in June. The ceremony was at the church, because that was where ceremonies happened in Caldwell Creek, and Reverend Peel performed it with a warmth that contained its own implicit apology for the events of the previous October, which Rosa accepted with grace, because she had decided that grace was the most powerful thing she owned. Mrs. Hollis cried. Alcott from the dry goods store shook Hugh's hand for an uncomfortably long time. The young deputy, a man named Ferris who had recently come to work with Hugh, and who admired him greatly, stood at the back of the church with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man who has recently decided that love might not be as impractical as he had previously believed. Rosa wore a dress she had made herself from blue cotton lawn that she had ordered from the catalog in April, and she wore her mother's small pearl earrings that were the only piece of jewelry she owned that had not been sold in the lean years, and she looked, according to Mrs. Hollis's later and repeated testimony, like everything that was right about the world. Hugh wore his second-best suit, pressed, with the sleeve mended. They moved into the small house on the north side of town that the county provided for the marshal. It was not large, 2 bedrooms and a parlor and a kitchen, but it had a proper garden plot behind it and a view of the cottonwoods from the bedroom window. And Rosa, who had been living in rented rooms for 3 years, felt the act of unpacking her things into a house that was hers with a joy so deep and quiet it was almost solemn. They set about building the particular kind of life that belongs to 2 people who have come to each other through difficulty, and have therefore learned not to take the ordinary things lightly. She kept her position at the dry goods store. He kept his badge. They had dinner every evening at a table that was not someone else's table, and he made the coffee in the mornings because he was an early riser and she was not, and she kept the household accounts with the same precision she applied to everything, and they talked, all the time, about everything, with the ease of 2 people for whom conversation has become the best part of the day. In the evenings, when the work was done and the lamp was lit, and the town was settling into its night sounds, she sometimes read aloud to him from whatever she was reading, and he would sit across from her and listen with that particular quality of attention he brought to everything that mattered to him, and she found in those evenings a contentment so complete that she occasionally felt she needed to remind herself it was real. They were happy. They were not simple people, and their happiness was not a simple thing. It had texture and history and the particular weight of having been earned, but it was genuine and it was growing, and it was theirs. In the spring of 1881, Rosa told Hugh she was expecting their first child. She told him at breakfast, in the kitchen, over coffee, with the May sun coming through the window and the garden plot already showing the early green of the seeds she had planted in March. She told him the way she told him most important things, directly and without ceremony, and he sat very still for a moment and then rose from his chair and came around the table and took her face in his hands with a gentleness that she had learned over the past year was the deepest register of his feeling, the thing he did when words were not enough, and touch was the only honest language available. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you feeling all right?" "I'm perfectly well," she said. "I have been slightly sick in the mornings, but that is apparently normal, and Bessie wrote me about it last year, so I was prepared." He laughed, low and full, and then held her against him with the cottonwoods outside and the coffee going cold on the table and the whole ordinary morning transformed. Their son was born in December of 1881. He arrived on a cold night with a wind from the northwest pressing against the windows of the little house, with Dr. Morris in attendance and Mrs. Hollis, who had constituted herself as indispensable for the occasion, present in the kitchen, keeping everyone supplied with coffee and controlled energy. Hugh stayed as close as he was permitted, which was in the parlor for most of it, and which felt to him like one of the longest and most significant nights of his life. When Dr. Morris came out and said it was done, and that both mother and child were well, Hugh stood up from the chair he had been occupying and felt the kind of feeling that does not have a proper name, the particular compound of relief and love and wonder that arrives with the knowledge that the world has just changed irrevocably and in the best possible way. They named the boy James, after Hugh's father, because Hugh had said that despite the stern distance, his father had been a good man who had worked hard and wanted better for his son, and he thought it was right to honor that. James Fletcher Crawford arrived in the world with dark eyes and a temperament that suggested he had opinions about things even at 2 hours old, which Rosa said was clearly his father's child, and which Hugh accepted as a compliment. The little house on the north side of town became something it had only been in outline before. It became fully, warmly, irrevocably home. James grew in the way healthy children grow, fast and consuming and endlessly surprising, and the house organized itself around him as houses do, acquiring the particular texture of a family life, the small chair in the corner of the parlor, the garden that Rosa now grew partly for vegetables, and partly for the flowers she cut to put in the kitchen window, the smell of bread that Bessie's recipe produced every Saturday morning, the sound of Hugh's boots on the porch in the evening. The town of Caldwell Creek continued to grow. The cattle trail was shifting by the early 1880s, the spread of the railroad making the long drive less necessary each year, and Caldwell Creek adapted the way frontier towns adapted, by diversifying the ways it made itself useful. A school was established in 1881, which Rosa was involved in from the beginning, serving on the founding committee and spending 2 afternoons a week helping the young teacher manage the older students who were old enough to be difficult and not quite old enough to be employable. A second doctor arrived in 1882. The dry goods store expanded into an emporium. A new lawyer set up a practice and proved, by contrast, to be considerably more ethical than his predecessor's activities in the county had suggested. Hugh Crawford served as marshal without incident of major consequence for several years, because the combination of his reputation and his genuine ability to reason with most situations before they required force had a quietly civilizing effect on the kind of people who might otherwise have caused trouble. Ferris, his deputy, proved to be excellent at the work and was much liked in town, and the two of them ran the marshal's office with the particular efficiency of two people who respected each other's way of thinking even when they disagreed on specifics. The case of the Holloway murder and the Dunmore conspiracy was not forgotten in Caldwell Creek. It became part of the town's story, the dark chapter it had almost allowed to happen, and the version of it that was told most often was the version in which the marshal had stood up in the church and produced the evidence that saved an innocent woman. What was less often told, but was known by those who paid attention, was that the woman in that story was not simply the person saved, but the person around whom everything that came after had organized itself. The presence that had made the Marshal's house into a home, and the home into the kind of place where a family grew in warmth and purpose. In 1883, their second child was born, a girl this time, and they named her Alina, for the woman whose letter had brought Rosa to Caldwell Creek and whose gentle, indirect hand had set the whole story in motion. Alina was as unlike James as a sibling could be, quieter and more watchful, and with a smile that arrived slowly but completely. And Hugh, who had sometimes thought that he had already received more than he had expected from life, discovered that this too was something he had not expected, this second capacity for wonder. Rosa watched him with Alina on a Sunday afternoon, sitting in the garden with the child on his knee and the October sun coming through the cottonwoods, and she thought about that first Tuesday at the boarding house when she had been rebuilding her life, one careful step at a time, and had not yet understood what was possible, and she felt the full distance between then and now with a clarity that was almost physical. She had come to this town with $32 and a carpetbag. She had been accused of murder and theft by a corrupt man who had calculated that she had no one to defend her. She had stood alone in a church full of people who had decided to believe the worst of her before they had examined any evidence. And a man had walked through the door with the sun behind him and his badge on his chest and a satchel full of truth, and had stood beside her, and everything had changed. She went out into the garden and sat beside him in the afternoon light, and he looked up at her with those gray eyes that still, after all this time, had the quality of paying complete and specific attention, and she thought that there was nothing she needed to say, that everything between them was already said, and she leaned against his shoulder and watched Alina examine a fallen cottonwood leaf with the focused seriousness of a 10-month-old person encountering a complicated world. And James was in the kitchen persuading Mrs. Hollis, who came for Sunday dinners now as a matter of tradition, to give him something he had been told he could not have yet, and the wind from the northwest was carrying the smell of the coming autumn, and everything was exactly as it should be. But the story of Rosa Fletcher and Hugh Crawford was not quite finished with its gifts. In the winter of 1884, a letter arrived at the Marshal's office from the Kansas Attorney General's office. It was a formal commendation, addressed to Marshal Hugh Crawford, for his role in the investigation and prosecution of the Dunmore conspiracy. With it was a note from the county sheriff, Aldecott, recommending Hugh for appointment as deputy marshal of the district, a position that would give him broader jurisdiction and considerably more authority, along with a modest increase in pay and the practical inconvenience of occasional travel to the county seat. Hugh brought the letter home and laid it on the kitchen table and told Rosa about it with the careful neutrality of a man who wants very much to know what another person thinks before he offers his own opinion. Rosa read the letter. She read it again. She looked at her husband across the kitchen table in the house that had been hers for 3 years now, with James asleep upstairs and Alina in her cradle by the fire, and she said, "What do you want to do?" "I want to know what you think," he said. "I think," she said, "that you are a man whose capability has been somewhat contained by the size of this assignment, and that larger work is a natural fit for you. I also think that Ferris is more than ready to take over the Marshal's office and that the town would be in good hands." She paused. "And I think that I have proven over the past few years that I am capable of managing a household, 2 children, a part-time bookkeeping position, and a school committee without requiring someone to be present for every moment. What I am not capable of managing," she added, with the particular tone she used when she was about to say something significant, "is you being unhappy with a smaller life than the one you deserve." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You would be comfortable with the travel." "The travel is manageable," she said. "Right back." He accepted the appointment in January of 1885. The transition was smooth. Ferris was sworn in as marshal with Hugh's endorsement and the county sheriff's blessing, and the town received this change with the equanimity of a community that had grown comfortable enough in its own order to trust it to new hands. Hugh took on the district work with the same methodical clarity he brought to everything, and the travel, while occasionally inconvenient, had the practical benefit of being finite and predictable, so that he was home for all the things that mattered and only away for the things that required his presence elsewhere. In the spring of 1885, Rosa closed the accounts on her bookkeeping position at the dry goods store. Not because the work was not satisfying, but because Alcott had finally found a young man trained in accounts who needed the full-time position, and Rosa had another project in mind. She opened a school supply and bookstore. It was a small establishment, operating out of a storefront on the main street, and it sold books and school materials and stationery, and importantly, provided a lending library function that the town had been without since its founding. Rosa had been thinking about this since the school was established, and she had been saving toward it quietly for 2 years. And when she opened the doors in April of 1885 with a carefully curated selection of 60 books and an account book that was already showing its first month's orders, she felt a satisfaction that was entirely particular to a thing built from one's own vision and one's own persistent work. Hugh came to the opening and stood in the middle of the small shop with the books on their new shelves and the morning light through the clean windows, and looked around with an expression that she had come to know as his version of profound approval, which was quieter than other people's applause but worth considerably more to her. "This is exactly right," he said. "I know," she said. Caldwell Creek grew around the bookstore the way towns grow around things that give them cultural substance, not dramatically, but with the slow accumulation of habit and affection. Women came to borrow novels. Families came to buy primers for their children. The young lawyer came to discuss new publications in jurisprudence. The teacher came on Fridays to select the week's reading material, and stayed sometimes for an hour talking books with Rosa, and these conversations became some of Rosa's favorite hours of the week. James, at 4 years old, was allowed to sit on a small chair behind the counter on the afternoons his mother was working, which he treated as the most significant responsibility he had been given in his life to date. Eleanor, at 2, was not yet trusted with this responsibility, and was attended by Mrs. Hollies on those afternoons, which Eleanor accepted with a sovereign indifference to anyone's opinion of the arrangement. In the summer of 1886, Rosa discovered she was expecting again. She told Hugh on a Tuesday morning, the same morning of the week, the same time of day, at the same kitchen table where she had told him about James 5 years earlier. Hugh made the same motion, rising from the chair and coming around the table, and she laughed at the mirroring of it, and he held her while she laughed. And the kitchen was full of summer light, and the smell of coffee and the sound of James charging down the stairs with the particular momentum of a 5-year-old boy beginning his day. The third child arrived in February of 1887, another boy, sturdy and loud, and immediately in possession of a personality that suggested he would require more supervision than either of his predecessors. They named him William, for no particular historical reason except that Rosa had always liked the name and Hugh agreed that it suited the face, and William, growing up between his serious elder brother and his watchful elder sister, became the sort of child who could negotiate any situation and charm his way through the rest. The house expanded, literally. Hugh and a carpenter spent 2 weeks in the summer of 1887, adding a room off the back that served as a proper study, which meant that the former study, which had been a converted sleeping alcove, could become a proper bedroom for William, which in turn allowed James and Eleanor to each have their own space, which reduced by a measurable degree the diplomatic complexity of the household's internal politics. The years between 1887 and 1890 had the quality of a well-made thing finding its full use. The children grew. The bookstore grew. Hugh's work as district deputy marshal acquired its own rhythms and its own accumulation of small victories. And if there were moments of worry when he was away and the news from elsewhere on the frontier reached Caldwell Creek in fragments and could not always be made reassuring, Rosa met those moments with the steadiness she had always met hard things, which was to say directly and without collapsing. Dunmore, in the Kansas State Penitentiary, petitioned for early release in 1888. The petition was denied. Rosa received formal notice of the denial and read it at the kitchen table and felt nothing much about it, which seemed to her like a reasonable response to something that was resolved and did not require any further emotional investment. The old Holloway Ranch land was eventually bought by the Land Trust's disbursement in 1889 as the 10-year restriction expired, and was purchased by a young cattle rancher named Bauer and his wife, who came from Nebraska and who had heard that Caldwell Creek was a decent town with solid people and a good school, and who turned out to be right about all of those things. Rosa sold them their first set of books. Hugh helped Bauer navigate the paperwork for his grazing license. They became neighbors in the broader sense that a frontier community creates neighbors, people bound by proximity and mutual reliance into something that is not quite friendship, but is its necessary precursor. James Crawford, at age 8, decided that he wanted to be a marshal like his father. Hugh said that this was a reasonable ambition, and that James should also learn to read contracts and manage accounts, because a marshal who understood the law in its written form was more useful than one who relied only on his instincts. James received this guidance with the gravity of a boy who has decided to take his ambitions seriously. Eleanor Crawford, at age 7, decided that she wanted to run the bookstore. Rosa said that this was an excellent ambition and that Eleanor should therefore begin learning how to manage inventory, because a bookstore that did not know what it had was only an expensive collection of dust. Eleanor, who had in fact already been reorganizing the shelves by some system of her own devising, accepted this as formal recognition of what she considered an already obvious truth. William Crawford, at age 3, decided that he wanted a dog. Hugh got him a dog. The dog, a brown mongrel of no particular breed affiliation but considerable personal charm, was named captain by William and became the 5th and arguably most popular member of the Crawford household, in the sense that he attracted unanimous approval in a way that no other member of the family consistently managed. In the fall of 1890, Hugh came home one Thursday evening with a particular quality of contained energy that Rosa had learned to recognize as the precursor to something significant. She was closing the bookstore accounts for the day. He sat across from her at the counter and watched her finish the column before he said anything. "Aldercott is retiring," he said. "He wants me to put my name forward for county sheriff." Rosa put down her pencil. She looked at her husband across the counter in the evening light of the bookstore, surrounded by books and the smell of print and the particular piece of a space she had built for herself, and she saw in his face the thing she had learned to read very well over 10 years of marriage, which was the exact texture of his hope and his uncertainty combined. "What does the position require?" she asked. "It's based at the county seat," he said. "We would need to move. The children's schooling would need—" "What does the position require?" she said again. He was quiet for a moment, then he told her. The county seat was a larger town, Pratt, about 40 miles west. The sheriff's position was a significant step, full administrative authority for the county, a good salary, a proper residence. It was work that fit him the way the district work fit him, with room to expand into. "And what do you want?" Rosa said. Hugh Crawford looked at his wife across the bookstore counter and said, "I want to go where you go. Whatever you decide is right." "Then we are in agreement," Rosa said, "because I decide that you should be sheriff, and the children need a larger school anyway, and I can open a better bookstore in a larger town. She picked up her pencil. Write to Aldecott. He wrote to Aldecott. The transition took the spring and summer of 1891. There were logistical complexities and farewells, and the particular grief of leaving a place where every stone and corner had been inhabited, until it felt like an extension of oneself. Mrs. Hollies was devastated and said so at considerable length. And then, with the practical resilience of a woman who had survived considerable difficulty, helped with the packing. Ferris was solidly reassuring about the town's future under his continued care. Alcott from the Dry Goods Emporium bought a significant number of books from Rosa's stock to seed the Emporium's own small lending shelf, and said it was the best investment he had ever made, not counting the original decision to hire her. The morning they left Caldwell Creek, Rosa stood for a moment at the door of the little house on the north side of town and looked at the garden plot and the view of the cottonwoods from the bedroom window, and held the 10 years of it in her mind with the deliberate attention of a woman who knows that some things must be properly experienced in order to be properly left. Hugh was beside her. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. They were both fully aware that this was a mirror of other conversations, that they had arrived at this word before in different contexts and with different kinds of stakes, and the awareness of it moved between them without requiring articulation. They left. The children were in the wagon, Captain the dog between William and Alina, James sitting straight with his father's particular posture and already looking ahead. The cottonwoods were gold, and the sky was the particular blue of a Kansas October, and the road west ran out ahead of them through the grassland with the clarity of a beginning. They arrived in Pratt to find it larger and louder and more complicated than Caldwell Creek in the ways that larger frontier towns were, and they also found it, over the weeks and months that followed, to contain the same essential things. People trying to build something, people struggling with the gap between what was and what ought to be, people who needed to believe that order was not a luxury but a foundation. Hugh became a good sheriff. He was the same man he had been in Caldwell Creek, with the same methodical clarity and the same stubborn honesty, operating now at a larger scale and finding, as Rosa had predicted, that the work expanded to fit him properly. Rosa opened the bookstore in a corner of the main street in Pratt, in a storefront twice the size of the one in Caldwell Creek, with a reading room at the back that served on Tuesday and Thursday evenings as a small lending library and occasional gathering place for the town's readers, who were more numerous than they might have appeared from the outside. Alina Crawford, at 9, was given full authority over the children's section. She reorganized it within a week. The years in Pratt acquired their own texture, different from the Caldwell Creek years but continuous with them in the way that a person's life is continuous, the same fundamental self making its way through different circumstances, and finding in each one both the expected challenges and the unexpected gifts. James, at 13, was still serious about his future. He had added to his ambitions, which now included not only law enforcement but the study of jurisprudence. And Hugh, who had continued his own reading in legal theory, spent evenings with his son working through questions of law and evidence with an engaged precision that Rosa found deeply moving to observe, the particular sight of a father and son thinking together. Alina, at 11, had opinions about every book that passed through her hands and had begun writing them down in a small notebook that she kept behind the children's section counter. And several of the adult patrons of the reading room had begun discreetly consulting her notebook before choosing their selections, which Alina had not formally authorized, but had not exactly discouraged either. William, at 5, had opinions about everything, including the dog, who was aging now with the dignified slowness of a dog who has had an excellent life and intends to take his time about concluding it. In the winter of 1893, on a Saturday evening when the snow was soft against the reading room windows, and the lamp was lit, and Hugh was reading in the chair by the fire, and James was at the table with his law books, and Alina was in the children's section, reorganizing something, and William was asleep with Captain at the foot of his bed. Rosa stood in the doorway between the bookstore and their attached residence, and looked at the whole of it, the light and the books and the people she had made her life with, and felt the particular fullness of a woman who has traveled a long distance through difficulty, and has arrived somewhere that is entirely, unmistakably right. Hugh looked up from his book. "What are you thinking?" he said. It was a question he had asked her many times over years of evenings, and she had always answered it honestly, because honesty had been the founding agreement of everything they were. She crossed the room and sat beside him, close enough that her shoulder was against his, and she looked into the fire for a moment before she said, "I'm thinking about a woman who came to Caldwell Creek on a stagecoach with $32 and a carpetbag, and almost lost everything before anything had really started." He was quiet. "And I'm thinking," she continued, "that if you had not walked through that door with your satchel and your evidence and your completely unreasonable willingness to ride 40 miles for the truth, none of this would exist." She turned her head and looked at him. "I don't know if I've ever fully said that. Everything we have, everything these children are, it started with you choosing not to let them make a lie true." Hugh Crawford looked at his wife in the firelight and the lamplight and the reading room light, and he said, "It started with a woman who came into my office with a careful question about riders near the South pasture and sat across from me for 40 minutes talking about nothing and made the rest of the world seem less interesting." She smiled. "I stayed on the condition that you saw me," she said. "I see you," he said. "I have always seen you." Outside, the snow continued its quiet accumulation, and the town of Pratt went about its winter business, and Captain shifted in William's room with the comfortable authority of an old dog who knows his place exactly, and James turned a page in his law book, and Alina finished her reorganization with a small sound of satisfaction, and Rosa leaned her head against Hugh's shoulder and felt the fire's warmth and the room's peace and the long, beautiful, hard-won permanence of a life built from truth and defended by love. There was nothing left unresolved. There was nothing left wanting. There was only this, the evening and the fire and the man beside her, and outside the reading room windows the whole wide frontier dark and full of stars.